Talk Radio Europe. Richie Allen. Tonight.
Welcome back to the programme. Now, the Bilderberg Group, which we've spoken about in the past on this programme, is meeting for its annual meeting in St. Moritz in Switzerland, which begins tomorrow, I believe, and runs over the course of the weekend. What are the Bilderberg Group? Well, let me tell you what Wikipedia says about the Bilderberg Group. It says the group, the Bilderberg Conference or the Bilderberg Club, is an annual, unofficial, invitation-only conference of approximately 140 guests, most of whom are people of influence in the fields of politics, banking, business, the military and news media. The names of attendees are made available to the press. Are they? We'll find out. But the conferences are closed to the public and the media, and no press releases are issued. Because of its exclusivity and privacy, the Bilderberg Group is frequently accused by conspiracy theorists from both extremes of the political spectrum of being an all-powerful secret society, fixing the fate of the world behind closed doors. Critics of Bilderberg conspiracy theories counter that it is nothing more than a policy discussion forum and social club which only serves as a means to brainstorm, to reach consensus and to create social cohesion within the power elite of Western Europe and North American nations, to better promote Atlanticism and a neoliberal form of globalisation. Now, we have heard from too many people in the past to take that entirely at face value. I'm thinking of people like Jim Mars we've had on this programme. We've spoken with Alex Jones, of course. We've spoken with Michael Rivero and many others. We've not spoken about Bilderberg for some time. I'm fascinated about it. Let's introduce our next guest and see what he has to say. I'm looking forward to talking with him. He's Tony Gosling. Tony is a former BBC journalist. He presents a weekly independent current affairs programme for Bristol Radio, and he's been studying Bilderberg and has formed his own opinions on it and what it is for over 12 years, and it's a pleasure to welcome him to Talk Radio Europe. Tony, welcome to the programme. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks for having me on.
Not at all, it's great to talk to you, Tony. Tony, Bilderberg, what is it? Why the secrecy?
Well, first of all, let's just go through that Wikipedia explanation,
yes.
Because it's an absolute load of nonsense, I'm afraid.
We've lost you for a second. Can you hear us? You know, this is not the first time this has happened when we've discussed this. So there's a bit of a smirk on my face. When we've got Giovanni on, it happens from time to time. And it's happened when we've had Jim Fetzer on as well. So let's try and reconnect with Tony. He's not there. You can't hear me, Tony, no? No, we can't. So we're going to have to take a bit of music. Right, apologies to Sly and the Family Stone. We might play a bit of that later on. Tony, welcome back to the programme. I've got to say, this has happened before when we've interviewed Giovanni Di Stefano, when we've interviewed Dr. Nick Begich, who talks from Alaska about HARP, and many others. They're cut off and interrupted. But make of that what you will.
Okay, well, anyway, let's get back to talking about
what we were talking about, exactly.
The Wikipedia explanation you read out there. Another thing is that it's all-powerful. Well, it's not all-powerful. It's powerful, but it's not all-powerful. There's also a lot of reference to Bilderberg having an agenda for a new world order. Well, I'm not really sure that the Bilderbergers have anywhere near a chance of having a new world order, because it's basically just a NATO organisation. It's from one part of the world. The Chinese are never invited to Bilderberg. The Russians are never invited. In fact, only people from the NATO countries go to this meeting. So they're certainly not... they may be pushing for an expansion of NATO, certainly in the NATO zone. But a lot of these, what called straw men are being put up by Wikipedia there. So what we're saying is that there's a lot of stuff which is conjectured about the Bilderberg meetings, which isn't actually what they're really about at all. And this enables, of course, it very, very easy for people like David Aronovich and various other people who try and are really apologists for these, what I would call fascists, is to actually make it easy for people like Aronovich to knock down criticism. So what I'm trying to do is pare down what Wikipedia was saying, you read out there, to something much closer to what this is really all about. So the other thing with Wikipedia is I actually registered as an editor on Wikipedia to add a few important facts to the entry about Bilderberg on Wikipedia, and I found literally within seconds of adding important facts which were fully referenced, that bit of information would immediately disappear.
So much for transparency then, and
for example,
Wikipedia,
the fact that the thing that really shocked me into doing something about the Bilderbergs back in 1996 was coming across a list of names. That was, you see the names of the people that go. They really are the most powerful people in the Western world, certainly in the finance world, the military world, and the big business world, and they control most of the money in the Western world, certainly in the NATO zone. And if you think about it, this is really the IMF, the World Bank, and these kind of people, including the Federal Reserve and the central banks of Europe, the biggest central banks in Europe. So, as you can see, right, what they're doing here is trying to find ways that they can get the criticism that people like I have put out there and knock it down. But I'm afraid that is kind of becoming more and more difficult. But the key thing for me, which meant that I had to do something about this, is when I discovered that the founder of the organisation in 1954 was a former SS officer in the Nazi party, the Nazi military, and that's Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. He actually married Queen Juliana just during the Second World War, actually, or just before the Second World War, and he became a sort of neutral citizen during the war. But in the run-up to World War II, he was an enthusiastic member of the SS, and I think any organisation which is founded by an SS officer needs a little bit of scrutiny. And the fact that we're being told that there's nothing to worry about, this is just a private little meeting, I'm afraid it doesn't wash with me. I mean, there's another aspect to all of this, and that is the connections with NATO, because Paul Hauser, who was a general, one of the main of Hitler's generals in the SS Panzer Corps, these giant armies of tanks in the Second World War, is actually quoted as saying that the foreign units of the SS, because there were several units fought in the Second World War which were sympathetic to the Nazi Party, these were actually the precursors of NATO. And that's a direct quote from Paul Hauser, this SS Obergruppenführer, or general himself. So there are obviously some quite umbilical connections between the present-day NATO and the SS of the Second World War and the Nazi Party. So this is one of the reasons why I really thought, no, hang on a minute, we can't just pass this one by. It's quite important to get some information up on the internet, some hard information and some hard facts to get rid of some of the conspiracy theories which were around in the mid-90s about Bilderberg, and do a proper journalistic job on this. And I think it's slowly but surely it's paying off. It's eating into their credibility, what I've been doing and what many people around the world have been doing. So, you may say, well, how can you make those connections? But,
no, I don't say that at all, Tony. I don't say that at all. I mean, I'm fascinated by it. I mean, I remember.
Look at what NATO are up to now. If you have a look, over the last sort of 10 years or so, we've had Kosovo, Iraq, of course, Afghanistan. NATO were the major people in there too. Now we're looking at Libya and NATO's erosion, essentially, of the rule of law. Now, I'm talking about international law as spelled out in the UN Charter. Now, the UN Charter was signed on the 26th of June 1945 in the wake of World War II, pretty much, as a very comprehensive document put together by a lot of the Allies saying, look, in order to stop a world war happening, we need to stick to this charter. A simple fact. What's happened, of course, is that NATO have actually begun eroding that charter. For example, if you look at the Libya situation now, there are several counts on which they have completely ignored the UN Charter in the actions in Libya. Even instituting a no-fly zone over Libya is against I think it's Article 2 of the UN Charter, because what the people said at the end of World War II is there's no excuse to invade or intervene in a country unless that country is actively attacking its neighbours. So just the fact that there's a civil war going on is no excuse to wade in on one side or the other side, because this actually can fuel a wider war. And this is actually what NATO have been doing in Libya. So, I think that's one aspect of... it's just the NATO's own countries. The other thing is the Secretary General of NATO, miraculously, if you look back at the old Bilderberg meetings of the last 20 years or so, always is selected at the Bilderberg conference. So he goes along to a Bilderberg meeting, and sometime over the next few months, suddenly he's crowned King of NATO. So it's quite clear that this is very, very closely connected to the NATO military alliance, which, of course, was supposed to be a defensive alliance. If you remember, the idea was if any of the countries in the NATO alliance got attacked by Russia or anybody else, they would stand together. That was what NATO was
Yes, that's right.
Well, it's gone way beyond that now, and it is now actually a danger to world peace. It's an aggressive military force, and we see NATO leaders in a kind of flight forward because there's so much chaos financially financial chaos, etc., going on at home, that they're trying to distract everybody's attention and their own attention into saying, well, let's grab resources around the world and then hopefully our finances will be propped up a little bit. Actually, this is a recipe for disaster and then possibly even a recipe for World War III.
Tony, I've got some points to put to you, and we've got messages coming in from our listeners all the time. With regards to Bilderberg then, I mean, it's been around since 1954, as you quite rightly said, under a huge veil of secrecy for so long. First point is, do we think then, I mean, it's great to hear you say that we don't think they have anywhere near the power they think they have, but are they, when they meet, seeking a consensus amongst each other to do things like we've seen in Libya and places like that? Are they basically meeting so that they all have their ducks in a row, basically?
I don't think that they are honestly seeking a consensus, because the decisions like the wish to attack Iraq, the decisions like, for example, the will to attack Libya, these are made behind closed doors. At the Bilderberg conference, what happens there is that these ideas are run past waverers, people who may be very powerful one way or another. Say, for example, editor of a newspaper, Will Hutton, when he was editor of the Observer newspaper, was invited along. And I wouldn't consider that Will is actually a fan of the Bilderberg's economic policy at all. So the idea really is to run these ideas past some of the guests who are there and woo them with the royalty, the kings and queens, the princes who are there, and try to get them on the programme, whatever that programme happens to be. In the moment, obviously, it's about the attack on Libya and possibly extending that to Iran and further an attack on Pakistan, possibly. And the idea is then that they'll see what the reaction in these politicians particularly is, and if the reaction is good, that politician then gets Bilderberg's backing from behind the scenes, from some of the media people who are connected with Bilderberg and the bankers, etc. But if they don't, then that's it. They're kind of frozen out, and then there'll be whispering campaigns against them and that kind of thing. So in a way, it's a kind of schmooze fest where politicians are groomed, they are looked at. It's almost like a horse fair. We had it described on last week's programme. I do a radio show here in Bristol every week as a kind of horse fair where the bankers and the chief executives of the big corporations of the world and some of the top military people have a look at the quality of the politicians and then make their selection. I mean, it actually makes a complete travesty of democracy. The other thing is, of course, big business is very, very powerful. It has lots and lots of meetings like this. The big banks and the big oil companies, media companies, all the big companies in the world, but particularly here in the NATO countries. And what they want is they actually want to bypass anything to do with the media, and they want to bypass anything to do with democratic process. So this is essentially what Bilderberg are up to, is they are undermining the media. They're trying to monopolise the media with their favoured people like Rupert Murdoch, and they're also trying to attack the parliamentary systems. Any kind of democratic system is attacked by Bilderberg and by Bilderberg's friends. I mean, for example, we saw the chief executive of Hollinger, which owned the Daily Telegraph, was Conrad Black. He was a big friend of Bilderberg's. He was also a massive union buster. And the other thing was, his newspaper, The Telegraph, was instrumental in stealing the hard drive, getting the hard drive stolen from the House of Commons with the MP's expenses on, which was an operation carried out by a former SAS major, and actually trying to undermine the credibility of MPs through this whole expenses scandal. Now, yes, one or two of the MPs were actually fraudulently claiming expenses, but of course this diverted attention from the massive fraud going on in the banking sector.
Yes.
So what they're trying to do is be really smart, these people. They've got so much money, they don't know what to do with it. So basically they're buying off our media and also buying off and trying to undermine and destroy any of our sort of parliamentary style democracy. And we end up, of course, with things like trial by television. What we saw recently with the Colonel Gaddafi being he's basically been everybody all over the TV is talking about how dreadful Gaddafi is. He killed Yvonne Fletcher. No, he didn't. He also is supposed to have blown up the Lockerbie plane. No, he didn't. In fact, documentaries shown on Channel 4 over the last 15 years or so have proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that Yvonne Fletcher, who was shot outside the Libyan embassy at a demonstration in London, was not shot from within the embassy. She was shot by someone